So today we're going to talk about Middlemarch, which is a great novel written by the English writer George Eliot. Middlemarch was first published in 8 installments in 1871 and 1872. It is now, of course, usually published in 1 volume. And if you look at the description box for this video, you will find a link where you can buy it and support my channel. Middlemarch is generally considered to be one of the best English novels of all time. Although it was published during the Victorian era, it is in many ways, I think, an atypical novel from that period. The novel is set in the fictional town of Middlemarch, and it follows the lives of many of the inhabitants of that town. Middlemarch is a complex tapestry of English provincial life set between 1829 and 1832. And today, I will do my best to tell you what I think makes this novel so great. And if you're new to my channel, welcome, my name is Juan, and I post a new book review every Saturday. The best way not to miss any of my book reviews is for you to subscribe and turn on the notifications bell. I don't necessarily think that Middlemarch is the most accessible novel from Victorian England. For one thing, it is long. This edition I own by Penguin Classics has more than 800 pages and the print is tiny. You would also need to know the context of the novel. And in this review, I will try to help you with that. But I would say that Middlemarch is perhaps the Victorian novel that would sound perhaps less old to us, less remote. In some ways, Middlemarch reads like something that was written a lot more recently than the late 19th century. And I think that is the main reason people continue to read it and enjoy it so much. But let's begin by looking at George Eliot and her context before we go into the novel itself, shall we? So, George Eliot is the pen name of the English writer Mary Ann Evans, who was born in 1819 and died in 1880. She's one of the most notable authors from the Victorian era. George Eliot wrote 7 novels in total, all of which are considered classics now, and all of which remain in print. In chronological order, they are Adam Bede, The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner, Romola, Felix Holt the Radical, Middlemarch, and Daniel Deronda. Despite what we may now think, it was not unusual for women to write using their real names in England in the 19th century. However, Mary Ann Evans wanted to escape the stereotype of the woman writer of her time. Also, she wanted to keep her privacy and let her fiction be judged on its own merits. And perhaps because it was her thought-out decision to do so, that's why her novels continue to be published under the name of George Eliot even to this day. But let's talk a little bit about Mary Ann Evans and not George Eliot for a moment. I think there are some facts about her private life that might illuminate Middlemarch. For example, Mary Ann Evans came from a provincial town, so she understood the life of small towns far from London. And this is something that comes across in all her fiction, not only in Middlemarch, which, by the way, was subtitled A Study of Provincial Life. All her novels have this. Also, Mary Ann Evans never got married, that is, legally married, but there was a man she referred to as her husband, George Henry Lewes, who was a philosopher and a critic. They never got married legally, among other things, because Lewes was already married to someone else, but Lewes and her lovely wedded wife had an open marriage, so he took on a second wife, Mary Ann Evans, our own George Eliot. Now her choice to publish under a pen name begins to make a lot more sense, I think, because her private life would have been so scandalous at the time, and let's be honest, many people would also criticize that even now, right? And that would detract people, I think, from focusing on her fiction. But let's move on and talk about her masterpiece, Middlemarch. Middlemarch is a fascinating novel for many reasons. One of them is that while it is a novel of epic proportions, it deals with ordinary, everyday events of ordinary, everyday people. Epics usually have heroes and describe incredible feats of courage in long form. However, the characters of Middlemarch are normal people who live in a small English provincial town in the early 19th century. So, why are the lives of characters like that so compelling to read about in this novel? I think a lot has to do with the context and how George Eliot uses it in Middlemarch. As I said, Middlemarch is set between 1829 and 1832. And what was going on in England back then? Well, the country was becoming industrialized. You probably remember that the Industrial Revolution began in Britain. So with the rapid industrialization process, society also began to change. Up until the Industrial Revolution, English society was very strictly class-based. So the family you were born in determined what your life was going to be like, what opportunities you would have or not have. And that's the world of Jane Austen's novels, for example. Social class was rigid, and the possibility of social mobility, that is, changing one's social class, was practically non-existent. However, industrialization began to usher in a new era where social mobility was more possible. A person could go up the social class ladder if he did well in business. And I say he on purpose because the situation wasn't as favorable to women. So in the 1830s, when the novel is set, English society was becoming more complex, and Middlemarch gets into the complexity of social relationships through different characters and different situations. That's one of the reasons why there are so many characters and so much plot in the novel. Another source of conflict in Middlemarch is religion. In the town of Middlemarch, as in the nation as a whole back then, there were different branches of Christianity represented. Catholics, Protestants, and evangelical Christians, all of them are part of the community. And George Eliot seems particularly preoccupied with the rise of evangelical Christianity at the time in the 1830s. Now, because the novel is so ambitious in its outlook and wants to deal with so much social change, there is no single hero or heroine in the novel. There are many main characters, but they are all connected to each other somehow, as they are all part of the tapestry that George Eliot weaves in the novel. I think that George Eliot's greatest achievement is that she is able to connect so many characters and so many storylines and still create a coherent narrative of epic proportions, while also at the same time portraying a specific moment of social change in the history of England. Another thing that makes this novel great is its approach to marriage. A lot of Victorian novels and beyond end with the marriage of the main characters. Middlemarch, however, often takes marriage as a starting point and then explores what happens to people after they marry. How very often their silly, romantic ideas about marriage turn out to be far from the truth. Eliot is not afraid to confront that reality in Middlemarch and tell her readers how disappointing marriage can be. And now I am going to say goodbye to those viewers who haven't read the novel or don't want to hear any spoilers, because between now and the end of this video I am going to talk about the plot of Middlemarch and its themes in a lot more detail, and there will be some spoilers. So if you don't want any spoilers, you should stop watching now, and I'll see you again soon, I hope, for another book review. I'm going to summarize the plot now. Middlemarch has so much plot, however, that if I went through it as I've done with other novels that I've reviewed recently, this video would probably be way over an hour, and I don't think anyone would want to see that. So instead, what I'm going to do, instead of going through everything that happens in Middlemarch, I will just summarize the plot as succinctly as I can. This is challenging, however, because there is in fact not just one plot in the novel. There are, I counted 4 plots. The first one, the life of Dorothea Brooke, who is also probably my favorite character in the novel. Then there is the medical career and life of Tertius Lydgate. Then there's the courtship of Mary Garth by Fred Vincy, and then the downfall of the religious hypocrite Nicholas Bulstrode. Okay, so this novel begins with, or opens with, Dorothea Brooke, who at the age of 19 lives with her younger sister Celia. They are both orphans who are under the care of their uncle. Both sisters are quite different. Dorothea is religious and has a suitor, a young man called Sir James Chetton, whom she doesn't really care for. The man she likes is the Reverend Edward Casaubon, who is a lot older than her. He is 45 at the beginning of the novel, and she's 19. Finally, Casaubon asks Dorothea to marry him, and she accepts, and Chatham begins to see Celia. And everyone's happy for the time being. Then the narrative moves on to other two characters, Fred and Rosamund Vincy, whose father is the mayor of Middlemarch. Fred is a bit of a loser. He went to college but never graduated and has no prospects. However, he thinks he will inherit a fortune from his uncle Mr. Featherstone, who has no children. Mr. Featherstone has a companion, Mary Garth, who is his wife's niece. Fred falls in love with Mary Garth and wants to marry her. Okay, we then go back to Dorothea's plot. Dorothea and Casaubon go to Rome on their honeymoon, and there begins their trouble as a couple. Dorothea admires her new husband's intellect and wants to be part of his intellectual life. But he doesn't want her to be part of it. Then Casaubon's younger cousin, Will Ladislaw, enters the scene. Ladislaw is immediately attracted to Dorothea, but she doesn't even notice that at first. However, the two become friends. Then the narrative goes back to Fred, who now owes so much money that he's unable to pay it back. Mr. Garth, Mary's father, had co-signed Fred's debt, and because Fred is unable to repay the money he owes, Mr. Garth loses a ton of his own money, and Mary Garth, loses all her savings. Now, as you can imagine, Mr. Garth is not exactly keen on his daughter Mary marrying Fred. Fred gets sick also, but the new doctor in town, Tertius Lydgate, cures him. Dr. Lydgate has a lot of modern ideas about medicine, but they are not always welcomed by the inhabitants of Middlemarch. He gets a lot of pushback and criticism on his ideas from the community, but finds an ally in a rich landowner, Mr. Bulstrode. Bulstrode wants to build a hospital following Lydgate's ideas. Then Dr. Lydgate meets Rosamund Vincy, who is a beautiful and self-absorbed woman. They get close, and even though at first Lydgate doesn't take her too seriously, eventually they become engaged. The narrative then goes back to Dorothea's story. We're not now back from Rome. We're in Middlemarch. Casaubon has a heart attack, but he survives. Dr. Lydgate is not sure about Casaubon's condition. For all he knows, he could live years, or he could just die suddenly at any given moment. Mr. Featherstone also gets sick, and on his deathbed, he reveals that he has drawn up two wills. He asks Mary to destroy one of them, but she refuses. That causes a problem because Mr. Featherstone intended to leave £10,000 to his nephew Fred, but instead his whole fortune and estate go to Joshua Rigg, who was Mr. Featherstone's illegitimate son. Now, back to Dorothea. Casaubon is beginning to suspect that she may be having feelings toward his cousin Ladislaw, who now also lives in Middlemarch, of course. Casaubon doesn't want Dorothea to marry Ladislaw even if he dies. So he includes some kind of clause in his will whereby Dorothea will lose her inheritance, all her inheritance, if she marries Ladislaw. Then Casaubon dies. And some people begin to think that Ladislaw and Dorothea are lovers. You know what people are like. But it is not true. Sure, Ladislaw is in love with her, but he doesn't tell anybody about it. He doesn't even tell her about it. He doesn't want her to lose her inheritance and doesn't want to cause a scandal for her either. But Dorothea actually begins to realize that she has feelings for him, for Ladislaw, her late husband's cousin. By the way, Ladislaw now works as a newspaper editor for Dorothea's uncle, Mr. Brooke. Now, going back to Dr. Lydgate and his romance with Rosamund, he wants to impress her so much that he also gets himself into debt and has to ask Bulstrode for help, right? So he gets a loan for Bulstrode. And another character with chronic money problems is Fred. He decides to become a land agent and asks his friend Caleb Fairbrother to intercede between him and Mary Garth, who is still obviously pissed about the money she lost because of him. Even though Caleb is also in love with Mary, he talks to her, as Fred had asked him to do, because he realizes that Mary actually loves Fred. Then a mysterious man comes to Middlemarch and changes everything. His name is John Ruffles, and he knows something about Bulstrode's past and thinks he can blackmail him about it. What had happened is that Bulstrode got his money, all his fortune, from marrying a rich but much older widow. That widow had a daughter, but she didn't inherit, the daughter didn't inherit any money after her mother's death. The reason was that the daughter had run away. Bulstrode had found her, but never told his wife about it, so he inherited the fortune instead. Basically, he stole it from his wife's daughter. That woman, the daughter of the wealthy widow, had a son, and we find out that the son is no other than Ladislaw. Ladislaw, you remember, is Casaubon's poor cousin who is in love with Dorothea, so everything is interlinked. Now, when Bulstrode finds out who Ladislaw is, he feels guilty and wants to give him money, but Ladislaw refuses. Bulstrode then worries about his reputation, but it's too late because his past misdeeds are already the talk of the town. Bulstrode is finally unmasked as the religious hypocrite he really is. Lydgate is also tainted by the scandal because, as the recipient of loans by Bulstrode, and also remember that they wanted to open a clinic together, well, people begin to think that he was also complicit with the old guy. So the only two people in town who still believe Lydgate are Dorothea and Fair Brother, but that is really not enough. So Lydgate and Rosamond are forced to leave Middlemarch amidst general opprobrium. Now, Bulstrode decides to stay in town, but nobody likes him anymore. Mr. Brooke, you remember, Dorothea's uncle and Ladislaw's employer, decides to run for Parliament. He runs for Parliament, but he fails. Ladislaw then decides to leave Middlemarch. But before he leaves town, he goes to see Dorothea one last time, or so he thinks. As we know, Dorothea is actually in love with him, so even if it means losing Casaubon's fortune, Dorothea decides to finally marry Ladislaw. Also, Fred has now become successful thanks to his new career as a land agent, so he and Mary Garth can finally get married. The narrative ends in chapter 86, but there is a final section in the novel entitled Finale, in which we learn what happens to the main characters. We learn, for example, that Fred and Mary are happy and have 3 sons. We also learn that Dr. Lydgate has a practice near Middlemarch and does reasonably well, although he was never able to fulfill his early ambitions as a doctor. He dies at the age of 50, but is survived by his wife, Rosamond, and their 4 children. Rosamond, who never really, I think, loved him, remarries soon after. She has no problem finding someone else. And what about Dorothea? Well, we find out that she and Ladislaw did get married and had 2 children. They are both happy for the rest of their lives. Eventually, their son inherits Mr. Brooke's estate. And that's it. In a nutshell, that is the plot, or rather the plots of Middlemarch. Now let's talk about the themes, and I think marriage is important. It is not an unusual theme for a novel of that time at all, but I think George Eliot approaches it so originally here. She's not afraid to show us the possible downfalls of marriage. For example, if you think about it, Dorothea's first marriage, her marriage to Casaubon, it's a mistake of huge proportions. All the expectations she had about marriage, about life with him, come crashing down as soon as she has the chance to spend any time with her husband. As early as her honeymoon, Dorothea realizes that Casaubon is just not the right man for her, and they will never be happy. She knows that. Casaubon is actually so mean that he even tries to prevent Dorothea from being happy even after he's dead, by including a provision in his will whereby she will lose all her money, all the money she will inherit from him, if she decides to marry the man who is the love of her life. But Dorothea's It's not the only failed marriage in the novel, far from it. Dr. Lydgate's marriage with Rosamond is also not exactly a bed of roses, and other characters such as Bulstrode, Fred and Mary Garth also struggle in their respective marriages. Another important thing to highlight is that despite changing attitudes about social class and I guess the new possibility for social mobility brought in by the industrialization process that England was going through, some characters in the novel suffer because of preconceived ideas about social class. For example, we see that in characters such as Fred or Ladislaw himself. Those social prejudices actually almost get in the way of Dorothea's happiness. Although in the end she is willing to lose the money she has inherited from her late husband Casaubon for love and chooses to pursue her romance with Ladislaw and doesn't care if that causes a scandal in town. Now, Middlemarch is so nuanced and complex. There are no villains or heroes in this novel, not really, not in the traditional sense. All the characters are complex or round, as opposed to flat, if we use Ian Foster's well-known definition of round versus flat characters. In Middlemarch, there's no simplistic battle between good and evil. Most characters in the novel do make mistakes. Most characters in the novel are shown to have prejudices, just like people in real life. No one is 100% good or 100% evil all the time. Another thing, George Eliot, or rather Marianne Evans, was an intellectual, and she shows off with all the quotes from European literature in their original languages that introduce each and every chapter in the novel. Now, those epigraphs are in, some of them are in English, but there are some in German, some in Spanish, some in Italian, and with no translation. Now, to me, reading Middlemarch makes it clear that George Eliot wanted to be taken seriously as a writer, and indeed, I think that she deserves to be taken seriously as a writer. 100 years after the publication of the book, give or take, another great English writer, Virginia Woolf, wrote about her deep admiration for George Eliot, and really, who am I to contradict Virginia Woolf, right? Now, if you have made it to the end of this video, thank you, and please, I would be grateful if you let me know what you think about all of this or any of this in the comments section down below. And this is all from me for now. I hope that you are all doing very well, and I hope to see you again very soon for another book review, I hope. Take care.